Well, I was born in Parkes in 1966, but grew up on the New South Wales Central Coast in Gosford, and I'd always been interested in the military. My father had been in the Army Reserve for a number of years. His father had been in the British Army in World War I and the Australian Army in World War II, and the other grandfather had been in the Air Force during World War II. So it was just part of the family that there was always someone in uniform at some stage. And when I was 13, first year of high school, there was a Naval Reserve cadet unit in the area, and someone suggested, oh, well, if you're interested in joining the Defence Force, you should go and try it out and try what the cadets is like. And the Army cadet unit, which I wanted to go to, was too far away, so I went to the Navy cadet unit and spent 5 years there and really enjoyed it. I thought, oh, Navy looks like a good organisation, chance to travel. So I decided to join the Navy. Because I'm technically colourblind, or colour perception 3, which means I've got some sort of issue with red-green, checking that out, there's an issue with me being a pilot or being a seaman officer, so I was not allowed to do those specialisations. So when I joined up, they said, oh, you could be an engineer if you wanted to, and I thought, well, I don't really like engineering, I'm not very good at maths. So I thought, well, what's the other options? And one was supply officer and one was instructor officer. And I said, well, which one goes to sea the most? And they said supply. And I said, oh, well, that's what I'll do then. It was all about, going to sea and going places and doing different things, and getting out of Gosford. I'd been to sea in Swan and Melbourne, and then the next time I went to sea was a couple of years after that in Canberra. So I'd done the time in East Timor in early 2000, and I went to sea again in Canberra, which was one of our amphibious assault vessels, and joined the ship as a supply officer. So I'm in charge of all the logistics activities on board, the food, the pay, the stores, the canteen, all those things that keep people's morale going. And shortly after joining the ship, we went off to the Solomon Islands because there'd been some issues there with some fighting on the island of Malaita between the certain Solomon Island groups, and we were there to support the peace monitoring group. So we stayed there for a couple of months, just being present and being available if things turned nasty to evacuate Australians out of Honiara mainly. Got back to Australia from there, and all was going well. We were looking forward to the Centenary of Federation activities in 2001, and then one morning we woke up to turn the TV on and see planes flying into buildings in New York, and pretty much after that the world changed and hasn't been the same since. We were told, basically get the ship ready, you're going to go somewhere. Nobody knew where, nobody knew when. They just said, get yourself ready for some form of activity. And then in November, we basically sail from Australia. You're heading to the Middle East. Where in the Middle East, don't know, but when you get to the Middle East, we'll tell you where you're going. So once we got through the Strait of Hormuz, it was basically you're going up to Bahrain. Once you get there, the Americans will tell you what you're doing. So we got to Bahrain in December of 2001, so that's 3 months after September 11. Joined up with the American forces that were operating in the northern Arabian Gulf, and were told you're going to be inspecting vessels coming out of Iraq to see if they're carrying contraband, which was mainly oil or dates. And the reason we were checking those cargoes because Saddam Hussein was basically using those commodities, oil and dates, to sell to get hard currency to buy weaponry. HMAS Canberra was an old ship. By the time that she'd got to the Gulf in late 2001, she'd been around for over 30 years. So there was a lot of effort to keep her going, particularly her engines and that sort of material. But as far as the platform for doing the job, she was really quite suitable. We had 2 helicopters embarked, so we could operate helicopters from either the forward flight deck or the aft flight deck. We had US Navy SEALs embarked at times. They were able to bring their vessels alongside us, tie them up, and then come on board to get fed, have showers, do training, and then go out again and do their patrols up into the Northern Arabian Gulf and across into actual Iraqi territorial waters. So as a platform for operating helicopters and as a platform for operating the US Navy SEALs, she was ideal. And we also did a bit of work refuelling other vessels. And we had our own boarding parties who could do boardings of Iraqi dhows and ships carrying oil. So it was a bit of a jack of all trades doing the tasks. Even though she was an old ship and she took a lot of effort to keep going, she was really quite suited for that sort of work up in the NAG, the Northern Arabian Gulf. In 2011, I deployed across to the Middle East, and we were based at the main Australian headquarters in Dubai, and that's where I worked for the 6 months that I was in that theatre. But there were occasions I had to go across to Afghanistan to check on logistics activities and talk to the people there about what they were getting and whether it was the right stuff at the right time in the right place. So I'd fly over a couple of times during my 6 months there to Afghanistan, went to Kandahar, went to Tarin-Kowt, went to Kabul, and at one point I was in Helmand province with the British at Camp Bastion. And I'm only saying this because the sheer number of casualties that have occurred in Afghanistan versus the number of casualties in Iraq, it was a much more dangerous place, I believe, than Iraq. Yeah, certainly there were things going bad in Baghdad, and they were mortared and shelled on a regular basis, but it seemed to be a lot more prevalent or a lot more frequent in Afghanistan. A couple of weeks before I'd arrived, an Australian cook working at one of the bases in Uruzgan had been shot by an Afghan soldier, so one of the green on blue killings that unfortunately were quite commonplace at that time. And another time I was there, an Australian soldier trod on an IED and was killed, and an SAS sergeant was shot by a sniper. So it was 2011 was a bad year for the ADF in Afghanistan by the sheer number of people who were being killed and wounded. And I was rarely in danger, but unfortunately, being in Afghanistan, things could go wrong. I'm sure the cook wasn't expecting to be shot when he was walking around the base, and there were some more green on blue killings at one of the bases there, where 10 Australians were shot, and 3 of them were unfortunately killed. I was working in the headquarters in Kabul at that point, and when that information came through, and so we were heavily involved in the evacuation of the wounded back to Australia, or in some cases to Germany, to one of the US military hospitals. We were heavily involved in the repatriation of those 3 Australian soldiers who were killed. And I didn't know any of those people who were killed or wounded, but on one occasion we had to tell some of the Australians who were coming back off leave and were about to go back to that base what had occurred. And one of them said, "Well, can you tell me who's been shot?" I said, "Well, technically no, but step over to the side here and I'll let you know who's been killed." And when I told him, he broke down crying because one of them was his best friend. I didn't know the guy at all, but for this guy I was talking to, it was a tragedy for him. And that was, so 2011 was a bad year. We had a number of people killed and a number of people wounded and a number of vehicles destroyed during the fighting in Afghanistan. And I was more than happy to get back on the C-130 and go back to Dubai, to the headquarters, because it was certainly much safer than working in Afghanistan. I went back again in 2014, back to the Middle East, again back to the headquarters in Dubai, and this was fairly standard, trying to spread the load across the entire Australian Defence Force. Certainly some of the RAN personnel who were on board ships, particularly engineers and communicators were going back in ships for their 4th, 5th, 6th, in some cases 7th deployment to the Middle East. For the Army, it was quite similar. There were people going back multiple times. So to try and spread the load, they were trying to get more Navy people into the land-based jobs, also trying to get more Air Force people into the land-based jobs, just so Army personnel weren't just bearing the full brunt of the activity. So I went back in 2014, and we were at that stage we were pulling a lot of our equipment and personnel out of Afghanistan, although we've still got people there now, but we were reducing down from 1,500 people or 1,200 people in the country down to probably about 300. So we were getting the personnel out, getting the equipment out, and handing as much back to the Afghan forces as was possible. So I spent 2.5 months pretty much in Kandahar, working to shut down the Australian footprint on that massive base. It's a huge base situated pretty much around the airfield at Kandahar. So getting our equipment out, or selling it off, or destroying it in some cases, because it was much cheaper to put the thing through the American giant shredder that they had there than it was to actually bring it back to Australia. So we were just basically getting stuff out, handing parts of the base back to the Americans. Tarin Kowt had been closed by this time, so the Australians had left completely. We were increasing our footprint in Kabul at the same time as we were reducing the footprint in Kandahar. And there were occasions when things weren't quite going to plan. There was intermittent rocketing of the base at Kandahar. These were Chinese-made missiles that were propped up against rocks, 4 or 5 kilometres away, well outside the base, with a fairly basic initiation control system attached to it, and a couple of batteries, and they'd go off randomly, and we'd have the alarm go off, and a lovely British lady's voice, telling us rocket attack, which was the signal to basically go to ground and stay there, and that happened every now and again. Fortunately, the couple of rockets that landed where I were several hundred metres away, so once you'd hit the ground and you could hear the thing go off, and then it was basically fine, because we had radar systems that would let us know that that was occurring. But you could always be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's just the luck of the draw. But certainly outside the wire in Kandahar, things were going wrong. There were suicide attacks occurring. I never went outside the wire. It was much safer to be inside the base. And similarly in Kabul, things would happen outside the wire, outside the base, which were bad, but inside the wire you were pretty safe. Certainly I was never out on patrol with soldiers, where things really could and did go wrong. I finally left the Navy full-time service in 2016, and I'm now a Navy reservist, and I also work as a public servant for Navy. I've been asked to go back to Afghanistan for a 4th time, but I wasn't available to be released at that stage. But certainly there's still naval personnel going to a landlocked country to do various jobs. And I think we're going to be in Afghanistan for the long term. I think we've still got about 300 people working there, and certainly the base in the Middle East is still well and truly in Dubai is well and truly operational, supporting what's been going on in Afghanistan, and more recently what's been going on obviously in Iraq. There, supporting the Air Force activities in northern Iraq. Most of the time nothing's happening, and then something will happen which focuses your entire attention for a short period of time on fixing that problem. it's also heightened for me that, you know, it's often the luck of the draw. You know, you can take as much care as you like when you're doing something which has an element of risk to it, but if it's not your day, it's not your day. You know, people who worked really hard to do their job ended up getting killed or hurt, and there was nothing in many respects, they could do about it. And yet other people who may have been in very similar dangerous situations walk away without a scratch. I think the last march I did was down a little country town called Walwa, down near the New South Wales Victorian border, because my CO who was on board Canberra lived down there, and he said, I want as many Canberra people to turn up to march in this little country town because they're a good bunch of people, and we need to be there. And despite the fact he hasn't been my CO for nearly 20 years, we still say yes sir, and we turn up, and we march down in that little country town.